and welcome to the Less is More Education podcast. This is episode 24 with Paul Emerich. Paul Emerich is a national board-certified teacher and education consultant. He is the author of Reclaiming Personalized Learning, Pedagogy for Restoring Equity and Humanity in Our Classrooms. His work is featured in Edutopia, EdSurge, ASCD's Educational Leadership, and Leaning Forwards, the Learning Professional. Thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And I wanted to start off with getting to know more about your educational experience, like your own personal experience, starting with elementary school, going all the way through college. So what was it like? Did you go through the standard public education route, or did you go through like private schooling or anything like that?
Yeah, so I'm from Chicago, the suburbs of Chicago. So I grew up in the northwest suburbs in a town called Mount Prospect. And I was very fortunate to have great schools growing up, all public schools, in, middle class, mostly white community. I loved school when I was a kid. Like I wanted to be a teacher when I was a little kid. I just absolutely loved all my teachers and I loved school. And that was true through middle school. And I should say those middle school years were hard as they are for lots of kids, but I always loved to learn. I was always like, I loved to read and I loved to learn new things. And I always loved to write. I loved math. And that continued into high school. In high school, my school experience changed a little bit because I became much more involved in music. So I was in choir and I was in the musical there. I was in show choir there. So I just like always loved school. I always loved to learn. And I will say too, that I think there's an element of like playing the game when you go to school, right? Like you can follow the rules, you get good grades. And I was always the kind of person who would follow the rules. Like I was a rule follower. I was able to remember things really easily. And so it made me like successful on paper in school, I think. And it wasn't until I got to college that I realized like that I was missing some things. I'd gotten good grades, I'd gotten good test scores, but I wasn't really a very independent thinker. I wasn't a flexible thinker. And I just had a really hard time, being an independent learner. And so that really guides me now as a teacher and as a coach of teachers, that we really don't want to teach kids in a way where we're just teaching them to follow rules necessarily. We want them to respect norms and respect boundaries. And, there are certain facts and figures we want them to retain for fluency purposes. But really, like the goal of education, in my opinion, should be to promote independent and liberated learners, and it's something that it drives me because of what I learned about myself going away to college. About what I didn't get from my education, all the while still being very grateful for what I did get from my education and my teachers growing up.
Yeah. I definitely saw that in my career teaching. I spent 11 years teaching in public education at the high school level. And I really did start to feel like what you're saying is I got all these good students, right, that were following the rules, that were trying really hard to learn and doing the things necessary to maintain their grades and everything. But when the moment I started to push them towards like, all right, here's an open-ended thing, here's something where you're gonna have to like work independently for a little bit, then you would see them start to flounder and everything. And yeah,
it's so interesting to observe that, especially in students who are scoring high on standardized assessments, because we tend to sometimes, I think, sort of write them off or go like, well, they've already mastered this, so we don't have to worry about it. But then when you like dig a little deeper, you give them an open-ended task, or you say, well, why are you doing that? Why does that work? I'm thinking of it, one student in particular I had who was like, according to standardized tests and according to those web-based adaptive tools that kind of just spit content at kids, according to those metrics, he was functioning at like a 6th grade level in 3rd grade. But when I slowed him down and asked him, why does long division work the way it does? Do you know why you're doing all of those steps? And, what happens when you come to a snag, or when you are you able to figure out if your answer is logical or makes sense? And he wasn't able to do any of those things or explain any of those things to me. And what that told me was that he was able to remember procedures and replicate them and basically do what people told him to do. But in terms of conceptual understanding and really just deep understanding of any concept, he struggled with that. And our system sort of incentivizes us to push kids through and just like keep going to harder and higher levels of content. But slowing down can help us see some of those things that maybe standardized tests or quantitative metrics don't measure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And there's like the love-hate relationship with the question why, you know, like, because I have two young children, and when they start going on that why, I'm like, I'm trying, I can only get to 10 whys, you know, but
Yeah.
at the same
Yeah.
time, I see like the value in trying to like pursue the answering those as far as I can. And I
Yeah.
saw it like in giving it to my students as well. It's like, hey, yeah, why are we doing this? Like why? And yeah, I'm going to get into a little bit more questions about the why of it all later on. But yeah, what made you decide to become an educator to begin with?
Hmm. Well, I had kind of always wanted to be a teacher. Like I remember trying to play school when I was a kid, and my siblings being like, "It's the weekend. Why are we playing school?" Um, and I don't, I think I actually started undergraduate work as or coursework as a music education major because I just loved music. And once I started doing that more, I realized that like I loved music, but I didn't want to teach it. I was more interested in
Uh,
performing and everything. And then I started working at a summer camp with school age kids during in college, and I just sort of had this feeling. I was like, I think I might want to be like an elementary school teacher. Um, and it really was just kind of this whim, like I think I want to do this. It just feels like the right thing, and so I'm just going to try it and I'm going to do it. And I like fell in love with it. And then I think I think the reason that one gets into teaching, or the reasons one gets into teaching versus the reason one stays in teaching, those are two very different answers, right? So at the time, it was like I got into teaching because I thought I was really going to enjoy it. I think there was a little bit of that sort of martyr savior mentality in me at the time that like, you know, I want to change lives kind of a thing, which is still, that's still there's an element of that that's still there, for me. Like, as I think we do good work and the work we do is impactful on kids' lives. But I think there's a fine line between wanting to partner with kids and support them versus saving them, And I think I was more of a mixed bag when I started teaching. Um, and now I stay in it because I'm just fascinated by it. And I still do want to support kids and I want to support teachers, and I do believe that education provides a path to a better life and just a more mindful and knowledgeable life. But I'm just so fascinated by how kids learn. Um, and I'm so passionate about people better understanding the education system and like the parts of it that don't work. And I'm also just so passionate now about being an advocate for teachers because I just feel like so much is thrown at teachers and teachers are blamed for so many things that are just outside of their control. And so that's really driving me now in the work that I do with schools and with teachers and with the work on sustainability I'm doing right now. It's really about appreciating what teachers are doing every day when they show up in their classrooms.
Yeah, yeah. I like that distinction that you made between trying to be the savior versus like trying to do what's best for the students, and how that affects your motivation as being a teacher. Every teacher wants to have like that stand and deliver moment, yeah, but that may not be the best thing for the students themselves, right? And yeah, I think that's a very powerful distinction. I really like that you brought that up. Another question I had was, what's it been like being a queer elementary school teacher? Um, how I know that that's a big part of you and your story.
Yeah, I mean, it's oh, what's it been like? It's like lots of highs and lows, when I started teaching, I was terrified to be out, and I only told a couple people at my school, and then before I knew it, pretty much everybody knew that I was gay. And then I kind of came to this inflection point in my fourth year teaching, and this was my actually ended up being my last year in that public school district in the suburbs. And a colleague of mine approached me and had an idea to do a lesson on marriage equality because it had just been legalized in Illinois at the time. And first, I was a little nervous about it, but then I was like, let's do it. And I write about this in Reclaiming Personalized Learning. I write about the whole story and just like what I learned from it. And I think about it all the time still, and I still probably one done things differently, but we ultimately decided not to notify the principal that we were going to do this. And in hindsight, it really was intentional. Like, I didn't think she'd say yes, and so I didn't ask for permission. I planned to ask for forgiveness if she was upset, which I don't recommend anybody do this because like I wouldn't say like I made a personal choice. And I don't want people to necessarily use this as a model for what they should do. I mean, if they want to do that and they've thought through all the consequences, and then fine, do what you're going to do. But for me, it resulted in just, and I don't regret it. I don't regret it, but it resulted in just like a lot of trouble and like hardship and turmoil and anxiety and stress for me over the rest of the school year, because at that point then like my principal didn't trust me anymore, clearly, and she wanted to go through my library and look for inappropriate books, which were LGBT books is what she meant by that in her email. And I would get surprise visits from administrators, and they would sort of like couch it with like, where I just want to check in on this thing, and when in reality they wanted to talk to me about that and see what I was doing. And so it really that, and as someone who was a rule follower, right, and who did what they were told, like that whole experience really kind of shook me in some really great ways, because now I'm like, I don't follow arbitrary rules anymore. I respect people's boundaries, but I don't follow. I ask a lot of questions, and I don't just mindlessly follow rules. So I ended up leaving that school because I was just like, I can't talk about people like me in school, and I can't think of a more dehumanizing place to be as a queer person, And actually, I remember the superintendent saying to me, he was like, Paul, this is not personal, like this is just, we have to make this decision for the community. And I said, it's like, Mike, that was his name. It's like, you're telling me I can't talk about people like me in school. How am I not supposed to take that personally? And he just didn't. I think his like cis straight perspective really colored that like this wasn't personal, but of course it's personal. So I ended up moving to San Francisco, and there, I mean, I had no issues being a queer teacher. Like everybody was very accepting. And then I ended up moving back to Chicago, and similarly, like by that time, and like being in the city and in an independent school, like it was very accepted. Like when I got married, my students threw me a wedding shower, and it was really nice. But it's still like, it's still not perfect. Obviously, in the current era, there's legislation now that's actively anti-queer, especially in elementary schools. Even in accepting places, or places that say they're accepting of queer folks, there's still microaggressions that queer teachers, experience frequently. I experienced them at my last school, even with the most well-intentioned people that like are relatively inclusive of the LGBTQ plus community in schools. So it's just, and that's hard, I think, to deal with. And I mean, I'm sure that, you have dealt with microaggressions in your life as well, and it's just it's just hard to deal with, because that people mean well, but what they do and say sometimes actually does cause harm. And so then it's sort of put on you to either hold those feelings or have the difficult conversation. And I think that's the hardest part of it, is like it becomes an added responsibility for you that you didn't really want and didn't really ask for.
Mm-hmm.
You sort of have to just accept it.
Yeah. There's definitely something there. right? I know, like for me, it's only come up like a couple of times, like my race and all that.
Yeah.
And when I think back on it, I I I try to like give the person or whoever is making the comments, like I I've learned to try and look at them in like the best, like give them the best like view possible, like or give them some leeway in terms of like, hey, look, I was driving my crappy car in college through a nice neighborhood because I was going to tutor somebody and I did get pulled over, and I'm like, yeah, this, I mean, I can kind of see their perspective too of like, this is pretty suspicious, like why is somebody driving like an old like beat up 1990 Oldsmobile, like through
Mhm.
this like wealthy neighborhood. And so there's like questions to be asked and stuff like that. And yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah, I'm sure like my color of my skin and everything like played into that. But at the same time, I try to look at it from their perspective of going like, okay, like if you're living in a nice neighborhood and you see a lot of nice cars going through, this one car is going to like stand out, right? And there's something that might be there or that might not be there. Maybe we should check it out. And that helps me like be more sympathetic towards people, I guess, even if they make like some weird comments, or if they do something like pull me over, without like a real valid reason.
Yeah.
Because, I wasn't speeding, I wasn't swerving, I wasn't, or anything like that. But yeah, yeah, I can definitely see how your experiences in that are pretty difficult and can be pretty difficult. Um, and I definitely sympathize with you and empathize with you. Um, the other thing, are you currently teaching in public education?
No,
No?
so in 2020, I actually left the traditional classroom, mostly because of COVID and just I was not comfortable with my school's plan to put us back in classrooms without vaccines. And so I started up my own practice then, and I still work with students privately, fewer than I did when the pandemic started, because I'm doing a lot more consulting work. So I'm working in public schools, but it's more as a coach and consultant now, as opposed to like a self-contained classroom teacher.
Mm,
So I'm still in touch with public schools, and I have two schools in Kentucky that I work with very extensively, and I just love it. I've realized that I just realized some strengths I have with instructional coaching, and it's really exciting. And it's like you do the same thing for 10 years, be an elementary school teacher. And it's not that there isn't anything new to learn, but it's just, it loses its luster a little bit. And so transitioning from full-time classroom teacher to, you know, coach, consultant, author has just sort of reignited my passion for what I do, but just from a different lens, or through a different lens from a different angle. And it's been really exciting. And then people said this to me. They were like, if you ever leave the classroom or you become a coach, you become an administrator or whatever, you're going to have those moments where you miss the kids and you miss having that community in your classroom. And I do miss that all the time, especially when I'm like in classrooms working with teachers, or I'm doing a demo lesson, or like the schools in Kentucky I work at. um, the kids know me now because I'm there so much. And the fifth graders are like, "What's up, Mr. France?" Which is so fun. And that makes me miss like having that. But like, then I think about it and I'm like, well, actually, I'm still kind of getting that. It's not in the same form, right? But then I'm also able to build these awesome relationships with teachers and watch them grow as teachers and know that I had a hand in that, and that just brings me so much satisfaction. So it has kind of like reignited my passion for what I do, and it's been great.
yeah, yeah, sounds like it. Yeah, that's the one thing I do miss a lot about teaching. I was in the classroom for 11 years, and those relationships that you would build with students, I particularly like miss. This is going to sound weird, but I miss like seeing students going through a hard time and then being able to approach them and have a conversation with them and, talk them through what's going on, and helping them out, and having that I guess mutual trust between each other that gets
Yeah.
built up with time, right? And those are the things that I definitely miss the most. And there's probably a lot of teachers out there that miss that, because I know a lot of teachers have left the classroom, especially within these past couple of years, which
Yeah.
gets me into like sustainability. I know your next book is on sustainable teaching, or your latest book. And so what is sustainable teaching in your eyes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had this idea for a book on sustainable teaching practices actually back in 2020. Um, and it came from distance learning. This is what I'm about to say is I think I'm in a very small minority of people that would feel this way. But when I transitioned to distance learning, like it wasn't very challenging for me. To me, it was kind of just like I had my stuff here at home, had my computer, I had my iPad, and I knew how to use Google Meet and, those sort of that tech component. But the pedagogy of distance learning wasn't that much different than what I did in my classroom, because I used open-ended tasks. I did not spend a lot of time photocopying
Oh,
worksheets. I'm not a busy work kind of a teacher. I either co-constructed assessment criteria with my kids or created learner-friendly rubrics that I'd share with them to help them sort of internalize the success criteria. So much of my instruction was, or so much of the kids' interaction with instruction was documented through journaling, which really entails just a blank journal, and they're writing about what they're learning about. I have some things to cut and paste in there. Um, but I just found the transition so easy. And I think it's because what I was doing and the community I'd built with learners, and the amount of independence I had built in them in the first 6 months of school, they knew the routines already. They were just doing them from their kitchen table. So and then I would hear other teachers at my school really struggling with distance learning, and the things they were telling me they were doing, I was like, well, that's not really a sustainable practice. And it requires you to hover over your kids and like sort of micromanage them along the way, which is not sustainable and near impossible to do in a distance learning environment. Like it's really hard to do. So I sort of had come up with this idea of like teaching from a distance as a double entendre, that we're literally teaching from a distance right now, but that, we should be teaching for independence, in part because it's a more sustainable way to teach, right? When we partner with kids and we share in the energetic demands of learning in the classroom, then it's no longer our job entirely to sustain learning in our classrooms. And that's like really at the heart of sustainable teaching. Like, where is our energy going? How are we distributing it? And how are we sharing in those energetic demands with learners and with other folks in our schools, so that it's not all on us to sustain learning all year long? And some of that is that. So the new book is structured in mindset shifts. There's 6 mindset shifts in the book. And those are all paired with like some practices that teachers can consider using that will make their teaching more sustainable. It's not a checklist of, it's not like if you do X, Y, and Z, then teaching will suddenly be sustainable, because sustainability is super personal, right? It's dependent on context and individual and boundaries that you have to work within in your district. And but at the same time, sustainability is not just a teacher problem, and I don't want to communicate that, if you just do these 5 things, your job will be more sustainable and you should have been doing them before. Because part of the issue with sustainability is that it's systemic, right? Or that the unsustainability of teaching is systemic. There are policies, rules, ways of thinking about teaching that just make it unsustainable. And so I do believe there are some practices like giving kids busy work, right? Busy work for kids creates busy work for teachers. That's something I think within a teacher's locus of control that they can change. Shifting towards journaling, I think, is a really sustainable practice. That's something that teachers likely can try in their classrooms. Backward designing units, like thinking in arcs when you teach, like that is, I think, a sustainable practice. There are these instructional shifts that I think teachers can embrace so that their energy is just channeled more efficiently. And then there's the piece of like coaches and administrators and people who do have more influence at the system level that they can do to make teaching more sustainable. So like policies, the way we think about curriculum implementation, the way we use standardized assessment data in schools. Like a lot of us don't have the power to stop using standardized assessment data, but there are people in schools that have the power to change how we use that data, which will contribute to sustainability. So like, if I were to distill sustainability down to one sentence, it's really about where's our energy going? How are we using that energy? And what can we shift to make it more efficient and more effective? But then what that looks like in practice is so complex because every school, every district, and the whole country for that matter is an ecosystem. It's an education ecosystem. And so we all have to act as individuals and make those incremental shifts, but we also have to be courageous and have those really difficult conversations about what's the policy, what's the systemic, structures, what are the systemic structures that are making teaching unsustainable, and start changing those, collectively through consensus and getting investment in that way. So it really is a journey. It's not something that you can just be like, check, 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 check. It it requires mindfulness. It requires curiosity. It requires bravery, vulnerability. And we have to be willing to commit to this journey towards sustainability in the long term.
Yeah. There's a lot in there. I'm also seeing when you're talking that there's some themes in like how we view the education system as a whole, and the role of trust at each of the levels, right? Mm-hmm. So when I hear you talking about sustainable teaching at the level of you being a teacher and your students, I'm hearing that there has to be a trusting relationship between your students and the teacher, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't be giving them the opportunities to go like, hey, we have this project. How do you think we should assess this? Right? And you can't do that without trust, right? Am I getting that idea correct?
That's a huge thing. Trust is, and it's also, we have to trust teachers, right? Part of the problem, part of what makes teaching unsustainable, and I'm not trying to paint all administrators with a broad brush, is that the system has sort of incentivized administrators to micromanage teachers and not trust them and tell them, no, you have to teach in this way, you have to use this manual with fidelity, you have, all these directives. And if you think about the impact that has on an individual, right? It's like, oh, you don't trust me. You don't think I'm knowledgeable and well-trained enough to do this job that you hired me for. And what that does is it chips away at an individual's sense of autonomy, their sense of accomplishment, like I'm setting goals for myself and I'm growing at this, this thing called teaching. And it just chips away at motivation over time. And to me, it's not surprising that we're seeing this mass exodus, of teachers, because people don't feel empowered. They feel micromanaged. And, it's like, we don't get into teaching for the money. We don't. Yeah. We get in it because we like doing it and because we feel a sense of pride from it. And when someone strips you of that, it's like, well, why would I stay? Why would I keep doing this if you're going to dehumanize me, take away my autonomy, and still pay me poorly?
You're right. Yeah. And that trust, in talking to even like legislators and people at the school board level, it seems to me like that the whole system from top to bottom is built on mistrust, right? And yes. It's like you see it at the state level, especially I'm here in California, and even in my 10 years of teaching here, or 11 years of teaching here, I saw like how the state just started piling on more and more and more requirements upon the districts, which push those upon the schools, which push those upon the teachers. And then we're the ones left carrying all that weight. And then we're all being judged on this one metric of tests and standardized tests. And that's being published and sent out to all parents everywhere as a way of judging the schools themselves, right? And that's all from top to bottom a system of mistrust. And so one of the things that really opened my eyes to that as being a big problem was when I started to look outside of the United States. And I started to look at, well, how do other countries do this? I read a book called In Teachers We Trust by I can't remember the name, Pasi Sahlberg, Dr. Pasi Sahlberg, who was working out of Finland, and now he's in Australia. But the whole book was just about how in Finland, they had an economic collapse in 1992 with the fall of the Soviet Union because their economy was built on selling lumber to them, right? Okay. And then by 2000, if you look at their PISA test scores, those are the international test scores, they scored number one. And then on top of that, you look at like happiness levels, Finland's always at the top. You look at like autonomy and well-being, like they tend to be up there on all these different metrics of what you want to see in a country, right? And I think education played a large part in that everything that they do is facilitated on that value of trust, right? We're going to train teachers. If you want to be an elementary school teacher, you have to go to school for 5 years, get your master's. Now that you're highly trained, we're just going to trust that you can do your job. And they just send them out there, and there's no like oversight in terms of, all right, how are we going to test all these students? How are we going to make sure that they're all getting the learning? No. We're just going to trust the teachers do that. And the teachers at the school level are the ones that are creating these assessments and creating their data and then pushing that out to the local community. Yep. So there is data, there is something there, right, that the community can look at and see like, oh, okay, is this school doing well? Is this school not doing well? But it's generated from the teachers out as opposed from the state down, right? And that's a big part of what I saw in a bunch of other countries as well, right? That, once I started to look out more into like Singapore and Australia and Canada, I'm like, oh, this trust thing is like, there's like a fundamental problem here in the United States. And that fundamental problem is what is pushing teachers out, like you said, or what you noticed. And so that's one of the things that I'm trying to push through the podcast and through my conversations with other people is like, look, this isn't the way it has to be, right?
Right.
There are places out there that exist where you can have a trusting system, right? Mm-hmm. And if you put the trust into teachers, then you will see great things happen. And I honestly just want to go back to teaching, but I can't do it in this system. The other thing that I was noticing when you were talking is you talk a lot. Do you know who Carol Ames is?
Mm-mm.
No, Carol Ames. You should. I'll send you like a paper by her. She was a teacher for a long time, and her whole thing was on motivation, right? And student motivation and researching student motivation. And as I'm hearing you talk, I'm like, wow, this is like exactly what she was writing about in 1990, which like blows my mind. I'm like, so people know, like we know the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. And it seems to me like what the types of practices that you're encouraging, where you're having more student-centered, where you're having students decide what or at least be in the conversation of how they're going to be assessed, what's the work that they're going to do, setting their own goals, and then holding themselves accountable. That's all intrinsic motivation right there, right? Then pushing for intrinsic motivation. The test scores, the busy work, the getting things done, that's all extrinsic motivation. And that's what we see with students that are good students, but they don't but they aren't like they flounder once they get into college, right? Because they are so good at doing all this busy work because that's what's been expected on them, right? And that's all extrinsic motivation. If I just do this, then I will get this. If I just do this, then I will get this. But when you want to be an independent thinker and when you want to be an independent person, that motivation can't be coming in from the outside. It has to be coming from the inside out, right?
Yep.
Why do I want to learn this, right? Why am I pursuing this? Why, like, what is it that I'm trying to do, right? And then connecting it to the person, like, and seeing like, all right, you've just had a success. The success wasn't because you did all the work that the teacher did or gave you. The success came from you taking some skills that you learned and you applied it, right? And then you saw a product of something that you did. So all of this is coming in from you, right? And making students hyper aware of you are the one that are applying the tactics. You are the one that is creating these projects and writing these journals and seeing your growth, and all that is providing intrinsic motivation. And so I saw, you know, your writing, and I just been thinking about Carol Ames recently, and I was like, oh, a lot of meshing, a lot of similarities right there. And
That
so,
actually, oh, I'm sorry.
oh no, go ahead.
Um, I was gonna say that actually aligns with one of the mindset shifts that I mentioned as the 6 mindset shifts for sustainable teaching. One of them is empowerment over control. And that applies to empowering or creating the conditions within which learners feel empowered, but it's also creating the conditions within which teachers feel empowered and coaches feel empowered and administrators feel empowered, right? Because if everyone in a school building feels empowered and, to your point, trusted to make decisions within their sphere of influence, then there you are sharing in the energetic demands of sustaining learning in a whole school. And so trust is so central to that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. There were some other things. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of all of this is in California, at least, because, you know, I'm in California and I focus a lot in California, there doesn't seem to be and I heard you talk about this in one of your Instagram posts, about there has to be like a clear vision for teaching, right? And I think there should be on the above that, a clear vision for education itself, right? And there doesn't seem to be one in California. If I go to the California Department of Education website, it just says that their goal is to educate students, which is kind of circular. You look at the State Board of Education, his office, you know, they have a mission statement, but then it changes every time the president of the State Board of Education changes.
Yeah.
So you start to see like, oh, we're going in this direction, now we're going in this direction, now we're going in this direction, now we're going in this direction. And it's so frenetic. So I wanted to see what you thought of this purpose for education, right? And get your thoughts on, what do you think of this? Is there something missing? Is there something that maybe I hadn't thought about? And because one of the things that I want to do is I want to collaborate with everybody and talk to as many people as I can about education and see, well, what do you think about this purpose for education? And it goes to holistically develop young people to realize their passions and take the lead in their own lives so that they may take responsibility for themselves and contribute to their local communities.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the challenging thing about this all, right, is that like values impact why we educate kids, how we educate kids, right? And like, you know, what I hear and what you just said is this idea of, you know, independent, empowered learning, right? That like kids are able to a reasonable degree, right, be somewhat self-reliant. And I don't think we want kids to be entirely, so I don't think anybody is entirely self-reliant, right? It's like we all
Right.
do need each other and we need our communities. And like there's an element of collectivism that I think gets really lost in American society in general, but also in the education system. It's very like, I mean, that's what capitalism is, right? It's like there's a self-interest competition, sort of has this every man for himself vibe, that I think is really toxic sometimes. And so what I'm hearing and what you're saying is, it's like there is an element of this that is about individuals being empowered to think on their own and take care of themselves, but also there is an element of responsibility to contribute to the community that has raised you, right? Because and I think that's just such a fundamental flaw in the American way of thinking, that it's like if I just pull myself up by my bootstraps and I just try as hard as I can and I just only make good choices, then I will be responsible for myself and I will succeed. But that's just not true.
Mhm.
It's just fundamentally not true. The people who Anybody who has experienced success in the United States has experienced that because someone else has supported them along the way. And I don't care who you are, I don't care what your story is, someone along the way supported you and helped you, right? So I think that it's a long-winded way of saying I think that element of, yes, be reliant on yourself, but also be sure to recognize and appreciate and give back to the people and the communities that have lifted you up along the way too. And I think that's just missing, um, not from your statement, that's missing from
Yeah.
broader society. And then the idea of holistic, right? Like I think that term actually gets thrown around so much now, and it's become kind of a catch-all for SEL,
Mhm.
and that's like holistic means SEL, and it's like, well, actually, holistic actually means I'm a whole human being. And yes, that incorporates social learning, it incorporates emotional learning, like it incorporates executive functioning skills, it incorporates identity, it
Mhm.
incorporates privilege and oppression, it incorporates academics, all that stuff. But like when we use that term holistic, I think we need to actually talk about what does holistic mean? And to me, holistic connects directly with an individual's humanity. Are our schools and is the school system at large a place where an individual's humanity can be held sacred and where every child, every teacher, every parent, every administrator, every person that walks into our buildings, like, are they treated with dignity? Are they are they valued as whole human beings? Like that's what holistic means to me. And so I love that you included that word. And I think other districts, schools that use that word should be really intentional about what they mean by holistic,
Mhm.
because it will change practice. It will absolutely change practice if you define that word really well.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think one of the other things that would be really important is to not just be leading, but also to be modeling all of these
Mm,
practices. And that's one of the things that I find missing with teaching a lot is that, we encourage our students to work in collaborative work groups and, work collaboratively. But how much time is being given to teachers to actually do that in earnest, right? If you look at like the average amount of time that American teachers spend in front of their students, it's somewhere in the order of like 27 hours a week. The average for the OECD countries, which is, all
yeah.
these economically cooperating countries, which includes most of Europe, Australia, parts of Asia, uh, North and South America, the average is 19 hours, right? And for some of the really excelling countries like Singapore, they're at like 17 hours a week in front of their students. But the other time, they're being expected to meet collaboratively with teachers, to cooperate with them, to create lessons, to create assessments, to look at data, to, in some cases, they are uh, grading each other's student work, right? For this,
Mhm.
for the sake of equity and all that.
Yeah.
And that expectation, I don't see how we can expect the students to work collaboratively if we aren't giving teachers that time to work collaboratively as well and
Yeah.
deeply, you know, like,
Yeah, I think that speaks to like a broader challenge with professional learning, right? And just professional culture in schools that we don't always practice what we preach. We talk about all these learner-centered practices and giving kids voice, and then professional learning, people stand up in front of teachers for 6 hours and just tell them things. And it's like, how is that supposed to grow teachers and empower teachers and encourage teachers to try new things? It's not going to. Teachers are going to just open up their email and check their email and check things off their to-do list and lesson plan. And that's what you see happening, right? Like that's what
yeah,
happens in those sorts of situations. And yeah, what needs to happen instead is, I think, is job embedded professional learning, where teachers are like exploring questions, things they're curious about with their practice, or solving problems of practice in partnership with a coach or an administrator or their team or something like that. Because then it's authentic and it's meaningful and it's solving problems. And um, but what you're saying speaks to that, like there just isn't an alignment between what we tell teachers to do and then how we treat them, and then that translates into our classrooms.
yeah. And that's what I'm working towards right now is like trying to convince, people maybe at the school board level, uh, to see like, all right, well, how much flexibility do we have here? One of the problems with being top heavy is that with all the requirements that the state is having at the schools, on the schools, at that level, the reason why they're able to have all those requirements on schools is because they hold the purse strings, right?
Yeah.
It's like, if you do X, Y, and Z, we'll give you this much more per student, right? And if you do, and then that has just piled on throughout the years, and now it's gotten to the point where it's kind of ridiculous, where like really what, like I don't see what freedom we have at the school level, or at this, school board level even, you
Right.
know. Yeah. And so yeah, that's one of the things that I've been trying to like let teachers know, hey, there are places where and this I think will make teaching more sustainable, is if we have time dedicated within the week, and it has to be weekly, it has to be often, right, where we can sit down and actually collaborate. And we also need to know how to do that. There's a lot of like conferences, like PLC conferences, where I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds great, that sounds exactly like what we should doing. We're not going to do that. Why? We just don't have that time, right?
Mhm.
And then it's always the expectation that we just do this outside of classroom time or outside of the school day, and that's just not reasonable or feasible for a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, let me see, make sure I'm not missing anything else here, but I appreciate you being on the podcast with me today, Paul. I think we had a great conversation. And if people want to find you, they can find you on Twitter and Instagram at Paul_Emerick. Is that right? I
That
think you, yeah. And is there anything else you would like to leave us with before we call it a day?
I'm just so grateful we had this conversation. Thanks for reaching out to me. And yeah, if people want to reach out, I'm at Paul_Emerick. My book on sustainable teaching should come out in August. That's like the current projection. And yeah, I look forward to more conversations. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much. All right. All right, so there was my interview with Paul Emerick France. It was a very interesting conversation with a very interesting thinker. I really liked some of the things that he talked about in terms of busy work versus effective work, right? So busy work, he tended to focus on, these are more connected to like worksheets and just getting things done so you can put something into a grade book. Whereas effective work was more student centered, where you get the students involved in taking responsibility for, all right, here's an assessment. How are you going to get to that end product, right? And then having them come up with, all right, where are we going to, what kind of activities are we going to do? How are you going to assess yourself? How are you going to know if you understand what's going on? And these activities help out the student take ownership of what they are learning. And so it increases that intrinsic motivation, something that we saw as well with the work of Carol Ames. And so I saw a lot of parallels there between the two of them. I like the idea of backwards designing units, of going, okay, we're going to start off with the product. What is it that the kids need to be able to accomplish? And that should be tied to something in terms of like standards or whatever it is that you're going to be making. And then designing activities that kind of go or lead students into that. And these activities must also have the input of the students in mind. And that reduces the amount of work for yourself as well. I like his saying of like busy work creates like busy grading, something like that, where he basically says the more busy work we give them, the more we have to grade that work. And so it's not really useful for the students. And it's also a time suck for us as teachers. And we already have very little time. And one of the ways that he kind of moves towards that is, hey, let's have open-ended tasks instead of these worksheets. Or let's have the students actually journal and bring in all of that metacognition so that they know what the process is in their mind. And I like that it's giving the students independence. And I also like the idea of like there's like a collectivist nature to this. Nobody works on their own. You're always going to be at least guided by somebody else. And if we could introduce more of that into our classrooms, because in reality, that is how work should work, right? I try to input in, like, I think that shouldn't just be shown to the students. It should be demonstrated by the teachers themselves, right? There should be times where teachers get in together and collaborate on a weekly basis, and that should be a part of our work day. And if students want to come in, maybe drop in and look at that happening, or if there's opportunities for them to see that happening so it's being modeled for them, I think all the better. But the fact is that time is extremely limited in our school days, especially when I was working as a school teacher. We probably had, like 2 days, 3 days a month to get that work done. And that shouldn't be the case. You look at other places outside the United States, it's embedded weekly and it's hours a week, right? So we gotta start rethinking how we structure our days in the classroom. And the other thing that I found was very powerful that Paul was talking about was, well, what kind of a student do we want to make? Do we want to make a student that's really good at turning in work and getting assignments done and trying to please the teacher? Or do we want a student that's learning for the sake of learning, because they love to learn, because they want to learn something? And what are the structures in our classroom that are incentivizing that? Are we incentivizing that kids take ownership? Are we having them come up with ways that they're going to assess themselves or ways that they're going to do work? And that's going to have huge implications for when they go off into college. An intrinsically motivated student in college is going to have a much higher success rate than an extrinsically one. If you think about it, college is a lot of independence, right? You get to choose your schedule, you get to choose when your classes are, you get to choose what classes you take, you choose your major. You have all these choices, and if you're not used to or accustomed to making choices, then you're going to flounder. You look at the graduation rates in California, they're pretty bad, even when you compare them to the nation. I think I read a statistic that says that in California, college graduates drop out at a rate that's 47% higher than the national average. And that's because we keep taking away choices from the students, and we start making it more about, all right, what do I have to do as a teacher to show that I've covered these standards? And so there's a restructuring of the standards that probably needs to take place too. And maybe a rethinking of, well, where are we going to spend our time? Like, do we need to meet all the standards? That once I answer that a big fat no to that question, my life as a teacher got way easier. And I was like, all right, I don't have to cover all this. I'm going to pick the most important things. I'm going to dive deep into that. I'm going to focus on that. And then whatever happens, happens after that. All right, maybe I'll get ahead. Maybe I won't meet the goal. But at least I'll know that my students are getting this chunk of material, which I think is the most important. And we kind of have to do that because the frameworks for our standards are ridiculous. If you look at the NGSS framework, so that's the Next Generation Science Standards, that's a 1,500 plus document, right? Like that's ridiculous. That should not be a thing. But there is hope, and I really like the idea that if you make your curriculum intentional with it being intrinsically motivating, that relieves you as a teacher from having to collect and grade all this busy work. And as Paul says it, micromanaging. Micromanaging is not sustainable because it sucks up so much of your time and energy. If you make it more student focused and student centered and you walk them through, all right, here's how I take something that I want to learn and I break it up into pieces that are more manageable, and here's how I'm going to track my own self going through these. And then me as a teacher can help them in that process. And then we are now going to be responsible for, like, all right, where's your final product? Where's what have you learned? What can you demonstrate in your learning? And that reduces the workload for us. So overall, a great conversation, and I hope to be collaborating with him more in the future. Thank you very much for listening to Less is More Education podcast. And again, you can find us at Less is More Education, or on Instagram at lessismore.education. And you can email me at lessismoreeducation, lessismore.education@skiff.com, and share this out. And also you can contribute to our Patreon. Just go to Patreon.com/lessismoreeducation. You can find us there as well. And if you want to see any of this, any of the previous episodes in writing, if you prefer reading, I do have a Substack, and it's lessismoreeducation.substack.com. And there you can find my writing. Thank you very much.